Hey, U.S. history students, this is Mr. Baker. This is going to be another installment of Baker's Corner. Basically, what we're going to do today is a very, very quick review of our last session, and then we're going to actually take our idea of writing into another level and actually introduce the first prompt that you would possibly be able to see with Unit 2, which is on British colonial settlement. So we want to be able to kind of further understand the idea of causation, effects. Those two things usually go hand in hand, kind of like two sides of a coin. And then also, guys, what is going to be our first LEQ, or also known as long essay question. So let's go ahead and get started. So we left off last time talking about things like developing context and an introduction, establishing, that you know something about the topic that precedes a lot of the things that you're going to write about to kind of set the stage, as is oftentimes said. We talked about how to basically create a thesis based off of concepts that you're going to address, themes, etc. And we also talked about how to plan those things and connect different things. Like, for example, from comparison to, of course, causation. How do those two things actually come together? Because what you'll notice, guys, when you're trying to establish a clear line of reasoning with the thesis, it's very important as you kind of develop complexity within an essay to consider different variables, that word, basically. In other words, what are some different ways of tackling a question that show a reader, hey, I can connect this in a variety of different ways that shows a complex understanding. In other words, not just what the question is telling me to write about, if it's more of a political question or more of one that's causation based even, but one that actually also shows I can compare and contrast, I can show continuity and change. Now, we have not addressed continuity and change yet. That'll be in a future skill session, but it's good to keep that in the forefront of your mind. So a couple of things, guys, to keep in mind with causation and effects is causation requires the writer, you, in other words, to examine developments over time. Now, we can call these short-term or long-term. That's a little bit of a different term. The question is, what's the big difference? Well, guys, when you're looking at an event like a world war, that's long-term, like World War I. I'll use an example. That would be something like you're examining the development of things like imperialism or militarism or nationalism. In other words, things that kind of developed over the course of, let's say, 40, 50, 60 years, whatever it might be, maybe longer. What a short-term cause would be something like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, June 28th of 1914. So what's the point? Some historical developments might lend themselves a bit more to long-term than they do short-term, etc. So you, as the young up-and-coming historian here, guys, you have to make a decision about how you're going to categorize those, why, and more importantly, how are you going to use them as significant developments? Is one cause more significant than the other one might be? Why is that a big deal? A line of reasoning with your thesis might allow you to suggest that different causes are all significant. However, one of them is more significant, because of X, Y, or Z. Okay, so the writer must decide on the significance of causes and how they relate to each other. That is complexity, or at least moving in that direction. Okay, so if you have this list of causes, like the last brainstorm that we did in our last session, you considered things like geographic and environment causes, you considered things like political development, social things, okay, that could be things along the lines of religion, etc. All of those are going to usually have a cause or an impact on something developing. What you have to decide, what does the evidence suggest? Yes, the key word there, guys, is evidence. Okay, we have to be able to have evidence to allow us to prove our point. And that's what allows us to analyze, explain, reason about why. This development geographically significantly impacted the economy of a colony because this happened. Okay? And so the question, guys, here is, Could a cause still have an impact but not be as essential as another variable? Okay. Now, another variable could be, if you're looking at a different cause, it could be, let's say you're breaking down the colonies into northern, middle, and southern. You know, a variable could be, okay, they're all regions, but they're different regions. They have different kinds of geographies. They have different locations. They have different developments. Cities develop differently in these different colonies because of a variety of different reasons, guys. That is complexity if you're able to basically distinguish. You can't just say, well, you know, northern states had larger cities or colonies, pardon me. All right, you can say that, but if you don't explain the why and more importantly, guys, the because, right, which those two things go hand in hand a lot of times, it's important to keep in mind. And you want to think about, okay, how does an argument about one variable or cause impact you possibly making an argument against another kind of variable or a different kind of cause or whatever, okay? The question to ask yourself when you're looking at bringing effects into this, again, cause happens, effects happen, okay, is which causes and effects can be considered more responsible for developments than others? And again, you see this in bold for a reason. The evidence plays into that. Okay. All right. So things to keep in mind as you guys think about developing an essay or a writing based off causation and even comparison or any other ones, read the prompt carefully. Now, let's say the essay gives you evaluate, which probably more often than not would be causation. Okay. What's the one thing that we notice is that that essay does need to address some aspect of causation. But let's say you're like, well, I don't really agree with maybe a cause that they throw in there. Maybe the cause they want you to write about is geographic as opposed to political. Okay. Can you completely ignore geography? No, you can't. All right. They're going to expect that you address causation related to geography. But the complexity, guys, could be that while geography had this effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, other significant causes impacted the development of British colonial North America. Those causes included blank, a result of this, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So you're building up the line of reasoning with your essay. All right. And we'll look at that more on the next slide. Consider recording a list of causes and explain the importance of each. In other words, you're planning out what you want to say and how you're going to say it. Consider whether you would categorize them as minor or major. Now, that's very open, guys, to interpretation. You know that. But again, evidence. How you present an argument, guys, is very important. The evidence you used and also the way that you do it. And then last, with effects, consider the relative significance with explanation, which those, again, is more responsible. Now, what is going to be your first long essay? Keep in mind, this would be a 40-minute question if you're writing them on exam day, okay? So it is suggested that you take about 5 minutes to really plan, and you take about 35 minutes to really put on paper what you're going to think. Remember, guys, bullet points will not cut it. So you got to make sure that, again, when you put on paper that you're, first of all, not assuming your reader knows it. It's a big misconception. A lot of you guys are like, you know, if you have a teacher that is graded or scored AP, you know, they'll tell you the stories about, you know, you've got 1,200 people in a room or whatever, and they're all either high school teachers that have taught it or college professors that research and, of course, teach on it as well. Guys, you cannot assume that if you don't develop that description and explanation, we can't assume that the reader automatically knows what you're talking about. That means that as a writer, there's a lot of work to be done to be able to make sure that your writing doesn't have any stones unturned. Now, on the other side of the coin, take a look at the question here. We'll get to that in a second. We don't have time to write our book in 40 minutes. So you're going to have to think, how do I incorporate selective evidence, meaning things that I think are essential to really prove what I want to prove. So here's your essay prompt, guys, for assignment 1. Quote unquote, geography was the primary factor in shaping the development of the British colonies in North America. Support, refute, or modify this statement, considering the period 1607 to 1754. This is time period 2. Now, pause your screen, ask yourself the question, give yourself 5 minutes to really break down this prompt. And we'll do it together for just a moment. Did you have a chance to do that? You can do a lot with this essay. No question. Is geography influential? Yeah. Is it the primary factor? That's what you have to make a decision about. Are there other things that certainly affected the development of British North American colonies? This is not there in front of you guys, but if you're kind of learning to think about themes as you study these things, as you read, as you obviously attend your classes, then guys, what you want to think about is that almost every development is going to have multiple causes that you can have effects, that you can have comparison and contrast with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so political, environment, and geography are very closely connected. Economic, society, okay, people, religion, social development, things like that. So does this question really ask you implicitly to compare? And the answer is no. You see factors. So you want to be thinking about, okay, causes. But remember what we said last time. How could you connect comparison and contrast? Well, what does the prompt not tell you which regions to consider? It does not tell you that. It does not tell you that you have to only address British New England or the southern colonies or even the middle. Occasionally you'll have a prompt that will do that. This one does not. So if you think about it, if you're thinking, man, the development of New England was quite a bit different than the South, which is what should be going through your minds, is there a possibility that the causes, right, geography affects region? Sure. Is it possible to examine a different variable, something that's not causation, that could relate to, or that could relate to something along the lines of society, which would be causation, excuse me, but not geography? And more importantly, guys, beyond that, how could you compare and contrast different regions with that? And how could we also develop a thesis, historically defensible, that either supports, yes, geography was. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion to you all with this prompt. Probably the easiest way to develop complexity is going to either refute or modify. The question to ask yourself, why would Mr. Baker say that? I don't want to give away too much because this is your question to tackle. But guys, if you think about it, what does refute mean? Reject. This statement is not completely accurate. Is it somewhat accurate? Well, if it is, but there's other factors that affect the settlement, then that requires you to modify. Now, think about it like this. If you write a thesis statement that acknowledges geography has these effects on development, however, nonetheless, as a result, there were other effects or other causes that had significant impacts on these regions of colonies because of, let's say, the development of these cultures. You don't want to get too specific with those cultures because otherwise, why? You want to be able to develop that in your support paragraphs. But guys, think about it like that. You could easily have about a two-sentence thesis statement that modifies that, gives some clear reasoning, In other words, a clear line of reasoning. And as a result of that, guess what you've just done? One, you've created a thesis that goes beyond the prompt, so it's historically defensible, and you've created a thesis that takes into consideration multiple variables, meaning it's not just about geography that impacted these colonies. That puts you in a wonderful position, guys, whether you do complexity throughout your paragraphs. I've seen students do that throughout. I've seen students do it as a separate paragraph. In my opinion, either way is fine as long as you're showing your reader that you understand complexity. All right, we'll come back to that. If you're kind of wondering, okay, what exactly do you mean by that? There's a part of the rubric that I'll show you here in just about 5 minutes that shows you that. Now, guys, remember from our previous session, this is a suggested way to organize your thoughts. It is not required. If you have a better way to do it, that's fine. What I encourage you not to do is simply start writing and you don't have clear organization, because otherwise your thoughts will not really present themselves probably as well as they could have, because paragraphs want to be well organized. Okay, so just really quick before I show you the rubric, and then we'll be off to the races, guys, with essay number 1. Okay, so first of all, what do you need to do? Well, first of all, thesis paragraph key. Okay, the idea of context. How can you develop what is preceding, what is basically going to give the reader a good idea about what you are trying to do to set up that thesis that you intend to defend throughout? Okay. How long does that context need to be? I would suggest about 3 to 4 sentences, but guys, make it purposeful. In other words, it precedes your thesis for a reason. Okay. Your thesis can be a sentence or 2. All right. I know some teachers are a little bit more picky about that than others. The College Board suggests that this can be in your intro and or support paragraph. I'm a firm believer it needs to be both places. That way, I've had students, guys, in the past, as I'm sure other teachers have, they're watching this, that the thesis and the conclusion is much better for whatever reason. The student was writing, and something just great came to their minds, and they worded it better. Maybe there was a little bit more to it. Guys, make sure you do that. Okay. Topic sentences that take the reader directly back to your thesis or your argument, and outside evidence. Now, guys, keep in mind, Google, really, you should not have to Google this stuff. What are you reading? What is your teacher having you read that could be considered outside information? In other words, secondary knowledge, an event, a concept, things that are definite historical nouns, not just generalizations. And I'm a firm believer, guys, of the idea that we can't just mention or fact drop. Okay. Assume your teacher does not know it. And it's your job, guys, to convince he or she or they, whoever's reading your work, that, you know what, I got this. Okay. There's a show on ABC called The Goldbergs. I'm not a real big fan of using the word moron. The dad uses that. If you've ever watched it, it's kind of a fun little exchange. But guys, in all seriousness, assume that your teacher doesn't know it. Okay. Something to keep in mind as you develop your thoughts. Okay. Reasoning and analysis. Remember, the analysis of the reasons, explain, if you will, is about because. You're developing those ideas. You're making connections. And then complexity. And guys, remember, I would approach this honestly as if you have 40 minutes. Now, my class is going to have part of a few days to do this. So we are looking for you to have a structured essay. It may be typed, handwritten is fine too, as long as it's legible in blue or black ink pen. Okay. And so we're not looking for you to write the book. Just to let you know. But we are looking for you to use good evidence to show that you understand what's going on. Pause for a moment. The next segment will be a very short overview of how this question relates to the 6-point rubric in the College Board essays for any history that you might have, American, European, or world. All right, guys, did you have a chance to maybe think a little bit about, what is really the big picture of that question? All right, now for the AP board or college board, I should say, they're going to use a 6-point rubric. They're going to train all of your readers to read this question. This is an example of what a rubric could look like. It does not have everything in it as far as evidence, but it does have the points and how they would word them. So guys, again, your thesis claim, look what it says. To earn the point, the thesis must make a claim that responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing. Okay? In other words, do not just simply quote that prompt. Okay? That's why I suggested a moment ago that you basically create a thesis that is going to bring variables into it, is going to bring maybe things within a cause. So if you're going to make the argument that geography was the primary cause, and you think that that can be stated with confidence, what would be some reasons related to geography that you could incorporate into that thesis? All right, because otherwise, guys, you don't have those catchwords or catchphrases even to actually further develop. You're just going to say, well, geography was a primary cause. It's pretty much bringing that back into it. If you give reasons why geography affected the development of those colonies, maybe it's different regions or whatever, then yeah, that would be more complex, but it would also be something that goes a step further. Okay. You'll also notice contextualization. This should precede your thesis. What is the basic nuts and bolts, guys? They don't use that whole setting up. That's probably not as complex in wording, but they say describes a broader historical context that is relevant to the prompt. Okay. Now, broad does not mean that we don't need to bring some specific concepts or even some specific things into it. Okay, so simply saying, well, the different colonial regions developed differently, that is not going to develop context. But if you're to explain a little bit, doesn't have to be lengthy, 3 or 4 sentences about how, ways, you're not going into great detail because that's your support, right, which will be further into your essay. But you could argue, guys, that contextualization is using some kind of evidence to develop or to basically set the stage or the tone or to develop what's happening. Okay? Evidence. Provide specific examples of evidence relevant. That's a key word, guys, to underline to the topic of the prompt. Okay? So let me explain what this is not and let me explain what it is. So if you're just throwing in a bunch of examples, this happened, this occurred, this development took place, but you're not really bringing it back to a thesis. That might be good enough for the first point here. I heard one person put it like this: if you simply throw something of outside evidence in there, it's a piece of evidence, it's not really well developed, it's not well described. It's kind of like a piece of a Lego. Everything that's put together, guys, after those Legos are put together, whether it's the Millennium Falcon or whatever it could be, that is going to be where you're putting together purposeful evidence. It flows well with what you're trying to prove. It basically goes back to, again, complexity. That's the difference, guys, between pieces as opposed to finished things that reflect a body of work. Okay? So look at what it says here. The response must identify specific historical examples or, again, supports an argument in response to the prompt using specific and relevant examples of evidence. In other words, guys, as your reader, as your scorer, whatever word you want to use for him or her, he or she, whoever, you're going to say, okay, I am now using this evidence more purposefully to help my argument. Okay. Now, last but not least, so historical reasoning and complexity. Okay. Historical reasoning has 2 points to it. The first one goes along, at least in my interpretation, guys, of what I've been told when I've trained is, let's say the prompt you're writing on is causation. We know that this one is. And let's say it says to address geography, and let's say you address causation, that's it. You don't really get into effects effectively. You don't get into maybe comparison or maybe a time period or something outside of that. Then you're probably going to be in a position to earn the first point here. Why? Look at what it says. Uses historical reasoning, e.g. comparison, causation, continuity and change over time, to frame or structure an argument that addresses the prompt. Okay, this is an example of how geography developed the colonies because, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and you develop that with some depth. Maybe it's not great, but it's there. That's most likely going to earn you the 1 point if the reader can see, okay, you're making a connection back to causation. Now, the question is, where do you go to the next level with this? We'll take a look. Complexity. Look what it says here, guys. Demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt. Using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. Now, you're going to see, guys, as you go throughout the year, many of your LAQs are not going to have support, refute, or modify. So what does the College Board expect you to be able to do to have that in your noggin? To be able to say, okay, I can support this, I can refute this, or I can modify. But you're doing it purposefully within the boundaries of the question. Now, here's where you have a lot of options with developing complexity. Okay? And I would encourage you to really think about which time period you're writing on, how confident are you with maybe one of these different things, and ask yourself the question, okay, if I don't feel like I can make a connection outside the time period, which you can see here, guys, connections within and across periods, okay, what you're going to notice, guys, is that as you move throughout the year, you will have more history to build upon. You already have some with world, a little bit with exploration, and a little bit with, of course, British colonization. But most likely, if you're watching this, you haven't really gotten into the revolution too much. You haven't gotten into like American imperialism in the 1800s. You probably haven't even talked a little bit about the world wars for good reason. Okay, but as you move on, that's why, guys, always connecting time periods, themes within them, politics, American, the world, social things. That's where you can really develop these arguments, but not just mentioning. Guys, look at what it says. Okay, to earn the second point, the response must demonstrate a complex understanding. Demonstrate is not simply stating it. Demonstrate means that you're developing it with well thought out details, connections to both in these things. So how can you do this? Well, look at it. Explaining a nuance of an issue by analyzing multiple variables. That could be, okay, geography, I agree. However, there's other variables that affected settlement. Develop that into your thesis. Guys, you've heard this like a broken record already in this video. You're going to basically address, yes, geography did. However, other variables affected it in these ways. What have you done? You've already identified a complex statement that you can build a thesis around, or that you have built a thesis around, excuse me, and you can either do one of two things. You can develop that within your support paragraphs, the earlier ones, or you can have a support paragraph at the end of your essay, or whenever you want to do it, that explicitly addresses just that. But guys, the support paragraph is not going to be short. It's usually going to be a well-developed connection. Okay? All right, explaining both the similarity or difference, explaining continuity and change, or explaining multiple causes, or explaining both causes and effects. Again, it's implied that you can bring cause and effect, continuity and change, the idea of comparison and contrast. Okay. So again, guys, the more that you train yourself to think about this, the complexity, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but I think it's going to be something, if you make it habitual, you're going to see that it's going to be something that you can tackle with a lot more success and probably a lot more confidence. Okay? All right. We just covered across time periods, confirming the validity of an argument by corroborating multiple perspectives across themes. In other words, different historians, different people have different views on this. How could you develop that? How could you develop, guys, different viewpoints about how colonies should be treated as opposed to not? Okay. And the last but not least, for sure, qualifying or modifying an argument by considering diverse or alternative views or evidence. That's very similar to the previous statement. Okay. This is key. Understanding must be part of the argument, not merely a phrase or a reference. Okay. So if you were to say something along the lines, British colonization closely resembled Spanish colonization prior to the 1600s in some ways, is that a good generalization? Yes. Does it prove complexity? The answer is no. You've not brought evidence into that to show how, whether it's social structure similarities or differences, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. For those of you that are in my class, this is the way that I'm going to be using that rubric to actually break down your grades on this assignment. So a 6 out of 6 would be a 50 out of 50. Okay. A 5 out of 6 would be a 46 out of 50. I will be using whole numbers like 192 once we move into what we call the assessment categories. We were not doing that yet because of the format we're doing right now. All right. And therefore, if you simply don't do it, you get a 0. Okay. So anyway, not fun to talk about goose eggs, but they're there. Okay. As always, guys, feel free to ask questions. By now, you should have a really good knowledge base and also a base of thinking to help you tackle this, to basically approach it as a student that can write. And the due date is on Canvas. As always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I do not read over rough drafts. I shouldn't say that. I do not give grades on rough drafts. I can give you a little bit of feedback on you're in the right direction. All right. But that will be the extent of it because you have a lot of these things to get started. But feel free to reach out. As always, have a good one, guys. Hope you're staying safe and have a good one. And I will look forward to seeing you all next time in another installment of Baker's Backyard or Baker's Corner. Take care. Bye-bye.